Chapter 8. The Jasper Improvement Society. Dalton was rudely awakened by a woman's voice calling his name. He thought he'd found a peaceful place here in his barn apartment, but what good was it if people found you where you slept? It was taking him a moment to recognize the voice.
"Hey, Dalton!"
The high-pitched call came again from downstairs, and he recognized it as Carrie Ann from the bar. She came up the stairs, without being asked, to find him still lying in bed. "Morning," she said with a cheerful smile. She had a brown paper bag in her hands. "I brought you some breakfast." "Oh, shit." Dalton groaned as he moved groggily over the bed and nearly fell out of the covers. He sat himself up on the edge and rolled his shoulders and neck before getting out to find some clothes. Across the room, Carrie Ann gasped as she saw he was naked and struggled not to stare at his toned behind. To occupy her mind, she slowly started taking things from the bag and laying them out. "So, how'd you find me?" Dalton asked, pulling on his jeans. "Oh, Carrie Ann attempted to reply, trying to look like she wasn't looking. It wasn't too hard. I mean, Dalton stuck a cigarette in his mouth and realized that she hadn't actually answered the question. Before he could press her, she changed the topic. "What did you do there last night?" she asked. Dalton lit his smoke, enjoying the first drag of the day, and assuming that by there she meant the double deuce. "What do you mean?" "Well, you fired the bartender, Pat," she explained. It wasn't much of an explanation as far as Dalton was concerned, since he couldn't see what the issue with that was. "He was skimming," he told her, guessing she didn't know. Carrie Ann chuckled nervously. "Well, you should not have done that, Dalton." Dalton still couldn't see the problem. "Yeah?" he said as he opened a window for some fresh country air. "And why's that?" "Well, you just shouldn't have, that's all," she unhelpfully reiterated before heading over to Dalton. "Here you go," she said proudly, handing him a coffee and something wrapped in paper. They sat down on the padded chairs and couches around the little table. "Thank you," said Dalton, as he inspected the squished thing in the paper. It looked like food, but he sure as hell wasn't going to eat it. He settled for the coffee. It was as good a way as any to start the day. "Oh my God!" Carrie Ann started up again around a mouthful of food. Dalton could tell he wasn't going to be able to enjoy his coffee and cigarette in peace. "What is the joke?" he asked, finding it tiresome now. "Well, there's no joke," she tried to explain. "I just think I'm looking at a dead man, though." Well, that took a turn, Dalton thought, but a turn he'd taken many times before. "It seems everywhere I go, I hear that same joke." "Yeah, well, something tells me you bring it on yourself," Carrie Ann concluded. Dalton couldn't say she was wrong. He didn't have to live this life, he chose to, so he had to take some responsibility for the ramifications, both large and small. That said, he hadn't caused Morgan to be an ill-tempered son of a bitch. He hadn't caused Pat to skim the till, and he hadn't asked Carrie Ann to come here and wake him up this early with all her cryptic bullshit. Maybe I'm just tired, he thought. He'd been sitting in this very chair last night, enjoying the cool summer breeze with his copy of Harrison's Legends of the Fall. He had been hoping to get through a few chapters and then turn in for an earlier than usual night, when some sort of celebration had erupted across the river. Loud music had been blaring from the big ranch house, and dozens of people had poured out into the night for some sort of impromptu pool party. The hooting and hollering had gone on well into the early morning, so now Dalton was trying to operate on about 5 hours of sleep, thanks to Carrie Ann and he couldn't quite remember the name of the ranch house's owner, the one that Emmett had told him liked to scare the horses with his helicopter. Dalton realized, thankfully, that Carrie Ann had stopped talking. He drank his coffee and waited for the caffeine to kick in, while he tried to remember the man's name. Brad Wesley careened down the highway at 50 miles per hour in his new poppy-red Ford Mustang GT. Shaboom was playing on the radio, and he was trying to sing along. "Oh, life could be a dream," he sung as he swerved back and forth across the two lanes. "If you would take me up in paradise up above," he went on, the 3 Bloody Marys he'd had with breakfast causing him to get some of the lyrics wrong. As he reached the next bend in the road, he saw some idiot in a battered old Buick coming his way. Still singing and still swerving across the lanes, he wondered if the driver was going to have the good sense to get out of the way. Thankfully, at the last minute, the other car veered off the tarmac, kicking up a trail of dust from the verge as it went. Good, he thought, looking back in his rear-view mirror, because he knew that he hadn't been about to move. All he wanted was to drive his car, sing his song, and enjoy his roads. And Brad Wesley always got his way. Dalton considered himself lucky to have made it to Red's auto parts store in one piece, having nearly been run off the road on the way in. Now he was here, he found that the place was still closed. He had to remind himself that this wasn't New York. Things moved at a different pace out here. He leaned on the hood of his car and waited a while, until finally an old Ford F-100 pickup truck pulled up beside the store. A man in a checked shirt and an old trucker's hat sauntered over, surveying Dalton's damaged Buick. "A new windshield's going to cost you more than that old beater's worth," he said with an honest smile. "My advice would be scrap her." Dalton laughed, but rejected the advice. "Well, I like her," he said. "So, order me one, would you?" The store owner clicked his tongue. "It'll take a few days," he informed him. "Ariel I can get you now." "Great," said Dalton, as he followed the man to the front of the store, where he unlocked the door to open up for the day. "You the boy from the Double Deuce?" the store owner inquired, as the bell above the shop door chimed open and closed. "Yes, sir," Dalton answered. "Yeah," the man replied. "Well, I kind of figured you'd be by. You want to put in a standing order now?" Dalton knew he'd be back here again, more than once, but that wasn't how he operated. "No, I'll pay as I go," he said. He offered his hand to the store owner. "Dalton." "Red Webster," said the other man, shaking his hand. "How long are you going to be in town?" he asked. "Not very long," Dalton told him, though he wasn't sure whether that was going to turn out to be accurate or not. "That's what I said 25 years ago," Red joked, heading into the back of the store. "Really?" Dalton asked after him. "What happened?" "Well, I got married," Red told him as he searched for the right Ariel. "To an ugly woman." He stopped his investigation for a moment to look back at Dalton. "Don't ever do that. It just takes the energy right out of you." Dalton laughed, not entirely sure how serious Red was being, but certain that he personally wasn't the type to marry and settle down for a small town life. "She left me, though," Red continued. "Found someone even uglier than she was." He brought the Ariel he'd found back to Dalton at the till. "That's life. Who can explain it?" he asked philosophically. Dalton had made a study of that very question for many years at college and beyond, and he still had no answer. "Oh, that's $5, Red said, pointing at the aerial. He pressed a button on the register, and the tray slid open with a ding as Dalton searched in his jeans for the cash. "So why'd you stay on?" Dalton asked as he handed over a $5 bill, feeling there was still more to Red's story. "Oh, I fell for the place," Red answered truthfully. But before he could elaborate, the bell over the door chimed again, and he looked up to see who was entering. Dalton saw the expression on his face drop, and slowly followed his gaze to the door. In walked two men. The first looked like he was about to head out on safari. He was sporting a loose-fitting white and grey striped shirt, sleeves rolled up, with a red patterned silk scarf tucked in around his neck. On his head he wore a white hat, which he took off now as he entered. For some reason, it made Dalton think about the incident on the road on the way here. Dalton guessed the man's age as about 50, but he looked good for it, walking with the confident swagger of a younger man. The man following him in had a different sort of movement altogether. He stalked behind the first, who Dalton assumed was his boss, his dark eyes scanning around and seeming to be looking for a confrontation, seeming to hope it would appear. He wore his denim shirt with the top few buttons undone, revealing a shark-tooth necklace underneath across his muscular chest, and he sported a gold cross earring in his ear. Something told Dalton that both of these men were trouble, a leashed attack dog, and an owner who wasn't afraid to let it loose. "Hello, Brad," said Red with a sigh, and Dalton instantly knew who the older man was. The helicopter-flying, party-hosting ranch house owner who had messed with his sleep last night. "Red," the man returned with a lazy smile as he walked over to Dalton. "Brad Wesley," he said, by way of introduction, his voice deep and confident, with a hint of gravel. He offered out his hand. "Dalton," said Dalton, accepting the hand with a shake. "He's working at the Double Deuce," Red informed the newcomer. Dalton watched as Wesley made a face that suggested this was new information, but Dalton got the impression that nothing went on in this town that Brad Wesley didn't know about. "Oh, terrific," said Wesley. "I hope you're going to clean that place up. Bad element over there," he said, shaking his head sadly. "Well, anything I can do for you?" he concluded, looking at Dalton, making it sound like a dismissal rather than an actual offer. Dalton could tell from Red's pained expression that Wesley's visit wasn't a welcome one. But one thing he'd learned over the years was to stay out of local politics. In fact, he'd made it a personal rule. It wasn't part of his job, and it wasn't his concern. "Thanks, Red," he said, tapping the aerial in his hand and heading for the door. As he went, the younger man, who had been dead-eyeing him over Wesley's shoulder the whole time, continued to hold his gaze, straining at the leash. Once Dalton had gone, Red turned his attention to Wesley. He knew exactly why he was here. The Jasper Improvement Society. A crock of shit. Wesley put his silly little hat down on the counter and sighed, a disappointed look on his face. "Well, Red," he said, "beautiful day, isn't it?" "It was," Red answered honestly. Back at the barn, Dalton attached the new aerial to his Buick and headed inside to change. He threw on some comfortable tracksuit bottoms, but didn't bother with a shirt, then headed back outside into the mid-morning sun. Finding a quiet place down by the river, he began going through his forms. His routine was not as solid or as fast as a karate kata, and there were no obvious strikes to speak of, his movements more graceful than violent. He flowed from one position to another in something more akin to a musicless dance, but each movement warmed and stretched a series of muscles in his body in a precise and well-trained order. He felt the muscles bunch, tense and release, totally in control of them and feeling for any areas of weakness or injury. Dalton trained until his body was coated in sweat and his muscles started to throb with a comfortable ache. He had relaxed his body, but the other aim of the routine was to relax his mind, and that hadn't come as easy. Something about Brad Wesley gave him a real sense of unease. Across the river, Brad Wesley was back home too. He'd driven his quad bike down by the river and now had to stop at the sight he'd been presented with across the way. He watched Dalton moving around, performing some martial arts mumbo-jumbo, and shook his head. There was certainly something different about that boy. Still, everything he'd heard about Dalton told him that this man was a serious player, not one of the run-of-the-mill bouncers that Tillman had hired before. When they'd met today in the auto store, Wesley had also got the feeling that Dalton was a strong man, or at least fancied himself as such. He'd dealt with strong men before, and certainly bigger. Generally speaking, Wesley had found that every man had a price in the end. It was just a matter of working out what it was. He got bored, rolled his eyes, and drove off, but as he went, he was already plotting. If it became necessary, he was sure that the right amount of cash, or the right leverage applied in the right places, would drive Dalton off. And if that didn't work, then we'll have to think of another way, he thought to himself. You just can't reason with a man like that.